I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now, weeks later. I had missed my train by 4 minutes, 4 stupid minutes, and ended up wandering down the mall just to kill time before the next one. My coffee was going cold in my hand. My bag strap was digging into my shoulder. I was tired, a little irritated, and not really paying attention to anything in particular. And then, I saw it. Or rather, I felt it first. That strange electricity in the air. That quiet shift that happens when something is about to go wrong and the world hasn't quite caught up to it yet. Let me take you back to the beginning. It was a Tuesday. Mid-October. One of those London mornings that can't quite decide what it wants to be, grey clouds sitting low over the city, but every now and then, a slash of pale sunlight breaking through and catching on the wet cobblestones. The kind of light that photographers love and everyone else just finds confusing. The mall was already busy for that time of morning. Tourists mostly, there are always tourists, no matter the season, no matter the hour. A Japanese couple near the Victoria Memorial taking photographs of each other in front of the gold-tipped gates. 2 teenage girls with matching backpacks trying to get a selfie with a mounted household cavalry officer who, as usual, refused to blink. A school group from somewhere in the north, you could tell by the matching high-vis yellow vests, and the slightly overwhelmed teacher trying to count heads. I had stopped near one of the benches outside the palace gates. Not to sit, the bench was wet from the morning dew, but just to retie my shoelace and adjust my bag. I was facing the main entrance. I had a clear line of sight to the forecourt. There was a small ceremony underway. Not one of the big ones, not the changing of the guard with its full band and crowds 5 people deep. This was something quieter, more official looking. A handful of black cars had arrived through the side entrance. Dark-suited figures moving with purpose. Staff in royal livery. The kind of subdued but deliberate movement that tells you something is happening without advertising what. I remember the woman beside me, older, gray-haired, wearing a bright blue anorak, murmuring to her husband, "Something's going on today." He shrugged. There's always something going on. She wasn't wrong. But she wasn't quite right either. Because what was happening today wasn't just something. And I didn't know that yet. None of us standing outside those gates knew it yet. But we were about to find out, in ways that none of us would have predicted, standing there with our cold coffees and our tourist maps and our ordinary Tuesday expectations. I've been to London enough times that the palace doesn't make me gape anymore. I grew up not far from here, well, an hour and a half out, in Surrey, and Buckingham Palace was always just sort of there. A fact of the city, like the Thames or the double-decker buses. You stop really seeing it after a while. But, that morning, I was looking at it differently. Maybe because I had time to kill. Maybe because the light was doing something strange and lovely to the stone facade. Or maybe, and I've thought about this a lot, maybe some part of me sensed that I needed to pay attention. The cars had come to a stop in the inner forecourt. Not quite visible from where I was standing, but close enough that you could hear doors opening. The crunch of gravel. The low murmur of voices. A man near me, tall, gray overcoat, the kind of purposeful stillness that makes you think he might be press, lifted a long lens camera and pointed it toward the gates. He didn't take any photos. He just held it there, watching through the viewfinder. Waiting. I noticed a ripple move through the small crowd that had gathered. That shift people make when they're all looking at the same thing without quite agreeing to. And then, through the iron bars of the gate, between the guards standing at their posts, I saw them. King Charles III. And Prince William. Walking side by side across the forecourt. Now, I want to be honest about what I saw and what I'm filling in from what I learned afterwards. Because those two things are not the same thing. And I think that distinction matters. What I saw with my own eyes, a father and son, both in dark suits, walking slowly. They were not hurrying. They were not arguing. They were simply moving together across that wide expanse of gravel, and there was something about the way they were moving, or rather the way they weren't moving, that made everything feel heavier than it should. William was walking slightly ahead. Or maybe Charles was walking slightly behind. The difference is subtle, but it matters if you've ever studied the body language of people who are trying very hard not to show what they're feeling. William's shoulders were set straight. The kind of posture you hold when you're bracing for something. His hands were clasped behind his back, a habit he's had for years, mirrors his father when he does it, but there was a tension in them. Knuckles slightly visible even from that distance. Charles, on the other hand, moved the way he sometimes moves when he's not well. Slower. More deliberate. Like a man who is aware of each step he's taking and is concentrating on the simple act of forward motion. The man with the camera beside me made a quiet sound. Not words. Just a small exhale. Like he'd seen something through his lens that I couldn't make out at my distance. "What is it?" the blue anorak woman whispered to her husband. She'd seen the body language too. "Do you think something's wrong?" Her husband didn't answer. Because there wasn't really an answer, was there? We didn't know. We could just sense. And then, this is the moment that made the whole crowd draw breath. Charles reached out. It was such a small gesture. You have to understand that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that belongs in a film, with a swelling score and a slow-motion lens. It was the kind of thing that happens between two people who have a complicated, old, layered history together, a reaching out that is part apology and part need and part something else entirely that doesn't have a clean name. He reached out and took William's arm. Not his hand. His arm. Just below the elbow. The way a man reaches for something he's afraid might slip away. William stopped walking. He turned and looked at his father. I couldn't see their faces clearly. I want to be precise about that. But I could see the shape of the moment. The stillness of it. The way two people stop in the middle of a gravel forecourt and the whole choreography of the morning pauses around them, staff freezing in mid-step, the nearby guard adjusting his posture almost imperceptibly because something real and human is happening and everyone within orbit of it instinctively knows to be quiet. They stood there together for what, 15 seconds? 20? Long enough to feel significant. Long enough for the woman in the blue anorak to put her hand over her mouth. Long enough for me to forget that my coffee was cold and my bag strap was digging in and I had a train to catch. Long enough for something to shift. And then, a door to the palace opened, one of the tall side doors, and Queen Camilla stepped out. I've seen Camilla in photographs hundreds of times. On the news, in the papers, on the big screens outside during the coronation. But seeing her in person even at that distance, even through iron bars, is different. She wasn't dressed for ceremony. That was the first thing I noticed. She was in what looked like everyday clothes, a pale coat, neutral colors, nothing state occasion about any of it. Her hair was pinned up but loosely, the way you do it when you're not expecting to be seen. She had no entourage with her. No aide walking a half step behind. No lady-in-waiting hovering. She was alone. And she had clearly just been crying. Even from that distance, you could see it. Or maybe I'm projecting backwards, knowing what I know now. But I don't think so. There was something about the way she held herself as she came through that door, careful, controlled, but not all the way there yet, that I recognized. It's the way people look when they've just let themselves fall apart somewhere private and are now doing the hard work of putting their face back on before they have to face other people. She stopped when she saw them. Charles and William, still standing together on the gravel, turned at the sound of the door. There was a pause. Then, Camilla walked toward them. And this is where even now I find it hard to describe exactly what happened, because the emotions of it were so layered, so complicated, that squeezing them into simple sentences feels almost disrespectful to what I was watching. She walked toward her husband and her stepson, and the three of them stood there in the gray October light, and something passed between them that none of us standing outside the gates were meant to see. The tall man with the camera had lowered it. I noticed that specifically. He'd had it raised the whole time, and he lowered it. Whatever was happening in that forecourt, he'd made a decision not to photograph it. I thought about that for a long time afterwards. There are photographers who would have fired off 100 shots without blinking. But this man had lowered his camera. And I found that quietly remarkable. The school group had gone quiet. The teenage girls had put their phones down. Even the mounted cavalry officer, trained to perfect stillness, seemed somehow more still. Whatever was happening in that courtyard, it had the quality of something private. Something that had spilled out into the visible world by accident, or by the particular gravitational pull of strong feeling. And we were all just witnesses to it. Accidental, ordinary witnesses. Standing on the pavement with our cold coffees and our train tickets, watching three people navigate something that had nothing to do with crowns or titles or the institution of the British monarchy. 3 people. A husband. A wife. A son. And a secret that, somewhere in the palace behind them, had just come undone. There's a particular kind of silence that belongs only to old buildings. I'm not talking about the silence of an empty room. I'm talking about something deeper, the silence of stone that has absorbed 200 years of whispered conversations, of doors quietly closed, of things said and unsaid in long corridors at odd hours of the night. Buckingham Palace has that silence threaded through it like a second structure, invisible but present. Even standing outside, even separated by gates and gravel and the ordinary sounds of the city, you can feel it. That morning, standing on the pavement outside those gates, I felt it more than usual. The 3 of them, Charles, William, Camilla, had moved off the gravel and back toward the palace entrance. Not quickly. There was no urgency in the movement, no crisis management sprint. It was slow. Thoughtful. The kind of movement that happens when the crisis has already occurred and what's left now is the long, difficult process of deciding what to do about it. Staff had melted away, the way they apparently do in royal circles, present one moment, vanish the next, as if they understand instinctively when their presence is the wrong kind of help. The doors closed behind the 3 of them. The forecourt was empty again. The crowd around me exhaled collectively. Phones came back up. The school group's teacher began counting heads again in a voice that suggested she hadn't entirely processed what she'd just seen. The teenage girls resumed their selfie with the cavalry officer, who still refused to blink. But the tall man with the camera hadn't moved. He was still standing where he'd been, camera now hanging at his side, and he was staring at the closed door with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something between professional restraint and genuine human disquiet. I don't normally talk to strangers. I'm a Surrey girl, we don't do that. But I found myself standing next to him and saying, quietly, "Do you know what that was about?" He looked at me sideways. Assessed whether I was press. Decided I wasn't. "Not for certain," he said. "But I've been covering this family for 11 years. He paused. "Something's been building for a while. I should explain something about Camilla and the way she is perceived, not by the public, not by the media, but by the people who exist in proximity to the royal family. The staff, the occasional witness, the peripheral figures who see the private edges of a very public life. She is not the person she was made out to be in the years immediately following Diana's death. I think most people have quietly arrived at that understanding, even if they haven't said it out loud. She is someone who came into an extraordinarily difficult situation, loving a man who was already loved by a nation in a particular, grief-raw way, and who navigated it with a kind of patience and steadiness that, honestly, most people couldn't have managed. But patience doesn't mean absence of private struggle. Steadiness doesn't mean the absence of weight. What I learned later, piece by piece, from conversations, from a friend who knows someone who works in that world, from a few carefully written paragraphs in a publication that doesn't normally traffic in gossip, was that what had happened that morning was the surface of something that had been underground for a long time. It had to do with a letter. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not going to pretend I read the letter. I didn't. Nobody outside a very small circle apparently did. And I'm not going to invent a specific content for it, because that would be dishonest and the actual situation was complicated enough without me making things up to fill in the gaps. What I can tell you is what I understand from those careful pieces I gathered afterwards, about the nature of what had come to light. There had been, for some time, a private matter that Camilla had been managing largely alone. That sounds vague, I know. But I'm using that language deliberately because the specifics matter less than the structure of the thing, a person carrying a weight that they have decided, for whatever reason, protectiveness, pride, the particular emotional isolation of public life, to carry without asking for help. William, it seems, had found out about it recently. Not from Camilla. Not from his father. From somewhere else, the way these things always eventually find their way out, not through a grand revelation but through a small, accidental detail that turns a key you didn't know existed. And it had hit him harder than anyone expected. Not because it was some scandal. Not because it changed the fundamental structure of the institution. But because, and this is the part that keeps staying with me, because William is, underneath the composure and the training and the weight of what he's been prepared for since childhood, a man who has lived through the specific devastation of feeling like the people closest to him kept things from him. He was 12 years old when his mother died. He was older than that, but not by enough, when he understood the full shape of his parents' marriage. The complications of it. The private anguishes of two people who were publicly claimed by a nation while being privately claimed by very different, incompatible needs. And then, he grew up and married and became a father and tried to, you can see him trying, if you watch him carefully over the years, to build something that felt more stable. More honest. More chosen. So when something came to light that suggested a person close to him had been, once again, quietly managing something alone, deciding unilaterally what he needed to know and what he didn't, it pressed on something very old and very tender. That's my understanding of it, anyway. The tall photographer, his name was Desmond, he offered it eventually after we'd been standing there talking for 20 minutes, had been on the press circuit for the Royals since the early 2000s. You develop a sense, he told me. He was looking at the palace gates as he said it, not at me, as if talking to the building rather than to a stranger he'd just met. For what's a surface problem and what goes deep? Today goes deep. How can you tell? He thought about it for a moment. The king's hand, he said. When he reached for William. The angle of it. That was a man reaching for a relationship, not a protocol. You don't reach like that for someone you're managing. You reach like that for someone you're afraid of losing. I thought about that for a long time on the train home. The fear of losing someone. Not to death, not to distance, but to the slow, invisible erosion that happens when trust gets its foundations quietly hollowed out. When a person realizes that the people around them, the ones they thought they knew fully, have been existing in a private space that was never shared. Charles reaching for William wasn't the gesture of a king managing a public relations situation. It was a father who understood, perhaps for the first time in a very raw and concrete way, exactly how his son felt about hidden things. About secrets wrapped in protection. About love that sometimes expresses itself by keeping people in the dark, convinced it's kinder that way. He reached out because he'd done it 2 years ago, and he knew the cost of it. He knew what it leaves behind in his son. There's a photograph, one of the official ones released at the time of the coronation of Charles and William standing together in full ceremonial dress. They're both looking in slightly different directions, the way people do in formal portraits. And, between them, if you look at the space between their bodies, there's about 2 feet of careful, dignified distance. But, if you look at their hands, if you look very carefully at where Charles's right hand falls and where William's left arm is positioned, there's almost a point of near contact. Not quite touching. Close enough that it could be intentional, or could be coincidence, and you'll never be entirely sure which. I've thought about that photograph a lot lately. I think that near contact is the whole story of them, in some ways. The almost reaching. The space that is always just a fraction too wide or just a fraction too close and never quite settles into something comfortable and understood. Until that morning in October. When Charles reached past the 2-foot gap and took his son's arm. And the whole carefully maintained distance collapsed for a moment into something much simpler and much more frightening. Camilla stepped out of that door alone. I keep returning to that detail. No aide. No lady in waiting. No protection officer hovering at the appropriate distance. She had come out of the building alone, in everyday clothes, her eyes red-rimmed and her composure only mostly in place. And the thing that makes it significant is that Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, is not a woman who steps out of buildings unprepared. She has been navigating the most scrutinized existence in Britain for decades. She knows better than almost anyone the cost of being seen at the wrong moment in the wrong condition. She came out of that door the way she did because she wasn't thinking about being seen. She was thinking about Charles. She came out because she had perhaps just been told that her husband was in the courtyard with his son, and the conversation that was happening out there was, in some part, about her. And she couldn't stay inside anymore. Not from guilt, necessarily. I don't want to flatten the situation into something simpler than it was. But, from that particular species of love that makes staying in the warm room impossible when the people you love are out in the cold sorting through something on your behalf. She came out because she needed to be part of it. Even if being part of it was uncomfortable. Even if showing up with her eyes still red and her coat hastily grabbed was not the image she would have chosen. She came out because whatever private management she had been doing, alone, of a private matter, it was done. It was out now. And there was no point anymore in the carefully managed distance. I didn't see what happened between the three of them inside. Nobody did, except them and, perhaps a very few trusted staff members who know, I suspect, how to forget things they've witnessed when forgetting is what's required. But, I have a theory about it, based on nothing more than the way the morning felt and the way the three of them moved and the specific kind of silence that sat over that forecourt after the doors closed. I think Camilla told the truth. Not new truth, not a confession of something hidden specifically to deceive. But, the fuller truth of something she'd been carrying in a way that, viewed from William's angle, had looked like a familiar and painful shape. Like protection dressed up as exclusion. And, I think Charles, who understood both of them, who knew what Camilla had been managing and understood why, who also knew exactly what it looked like to his son, I think Charles was the bridge between them. Not because he's a king. Not because he has institutional authority or centuries of protocol behind him. But, because he's a man who spent decades getting things wrong between himself and his children. Who has sat with the specific shame of knowing that your choices, made in what felt like the right direction, caused damage you didn't intend and can never fully repair. He reached for William in that courtyard because he knew that what his son needed in that moment was not a statement. Not an explanation. Not a managed communication through the appropriate channels. He needed his father to close the gap. Even if it was only 2 feet. Even if it was only for 20 seconds on a gray October morning while a stranger with cold coffee and a missed train watched through iron bars. Desmond, the photographer, tucked his camera back into its case before he left. He gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that means this conversation didn't happen, and walked away down the mall toward a parked car I assumed was his. I stood there for a moment longer. The school group was moving off toward the gardens. The Japanese couple had gotten their photographs and were consulting a map. The mounted cavalry officer was still, perfectly still, watching the middle distance. The palace sat behind its gates the way it always has. Immovable. Certain. All those centuries of careful architecture designed to communicate permanence and order and unshakable authority. And, behind one of those tall windows, 3 people were in a room together, doing the difficult and entirely human work of telling the truth. The train ride home is 47 minutes from Waterloo. I've done it so many times I don't even look at the platform signs anymore. I find my seat, I put my bag on the overhead rack, I lean against the window and watch London slowly unspool, the estates and the railway arches and the slow shift from urban density to suburban quiet to the first tentative green edges of Surrey countryside. That day, I didn't look out the window. I sat with my cold coffee going from cold to room temperature in my hand, and I thought about what I'd seen. Or what I thought I'd seen. Or what I'd witnessed that might or might not be what it appeared to be and that I was now reconstructing with all my own biases and histories and feelings about fathers and sons and things kept private and the particular loneliness of carrying something alone. Here is the question I kept coming back to: when does protecting someone become a way of keeping them out? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure there is one. I grew up in a house where things were managed. That's the word my mother used, managed. Situations were managed. Feelings were managed. The appearance of the family unit was managed with a precision that I admired as a child and found suffocating as a teenager, and now, at 34, think about with a complicated mixture of understanding and sorrow. My mother managed things because she loved us. I genuinely believe that. The management came from a place of care, of wanting to protect her children from the raw edges of the world, of believing that she could absorb the difficult things so we didn't have to. But what I felt, growing up, was not protected. What I felt was slightly outside of things. Like there was a room in the house I didn't have the key to. Like the real conversations, the ones that actually mattered, the ones where the truth of our family lived, were happening somewhere I wasn't invited. I don't think Camilla set out to make William feel that way. I don't think that was ever the intention. But intentions and outcomes are different countries, and the distance between them can be an ocean or a corridor depending on the specific architecture of a specific relationship. There's something particular about being a step-parent to children who have lost their mother. I want to tread carefully here because I know this is ground that a lot of people feel protective of, and rightly so. The grief that William and Harry carry for Diana is not abstract. It's not historical. It's theirs. It belongs to them in a way that no public narrative, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully written, can fully access. But I think about what Camilla stepped into, back at the beginning. The sheer weight of the expectation that surrounded her arrival into that family. The grief that had been crystallized into a particular shape by the public, the media, the collective emotional memory of a nation that had watched Diana's funeral and wept together and formed something like a shared ownership of her loss. To come in after that, to love a man who was already encircled by that history, required a particular kind of courage that I don't think Camilla ever received full credit for. She couldn't replace what was lost. She never tried to. And, trying not to try, being genuinely careful, genuinely restrained, taking up the precise amount of space that was offered and, no more, is exhausting in ways that aren't visible from the outside. I think that exhaustion is what I saw in her face when she came through that door. Not guilt. Not shame. Exhaustion. The particular weariness of someone who has been careful for a very long time and has finally, for reasons outside her control, run out of road. The matter she had been managing alone, whatever its specifics, had apparently been ongoing for several months. Long enough to become a habit of concealment, even if concealment was not the right word for it. Long enough for what might have started as a small private thing to quietly take up more and more space in her daily life. And it had never been about mistrust of William. That's the part that made it complicated, the part that made the situation more painful and, not less, once it came to light. She hadn't kept it from him out of wariness or calculation. She'd kept it from him because she was still, after all these years, adjusting to the weight of her own role in his life. Still calibrating. Still navigating the delicate mathematics of how much closeness to offer and, when and, in what form. She was protecting him from worry. And, in protecting him, she had, without meaning to, done the one thing that resonated most painfully with his history. Decided on his behalf what he could handle. I got off the train at my usual stop. Walked out through the station and stood in the car park for a moment before I went to my car. It was properly raining by then. Surrey gray, October gray, the very particular gray that settles in for November and doesn't fully lift until April. I didn't open my umbrella immediately. I stood in it for a moment. There's something about rain, proper rain, not drizzle, that has always helped me think. Maybe it's the sound of it, the white noise quality, the way it erases the background world and leaves just you and the immediate space around you. I thought about Charles reaching for William's arm. I thought about the angle of it, the way Desmond had described it. That was a man reaching for a relationship, not a protocol. And I thought about how many times in a life you get the chance to reach past the protocol of things, past the careful management, past the considered distance, past the years of calibrated behavior designed to hold something fragile together without breaking it, and just reach. Just close the gap. Most of the time we don't. Most of the time the gap stays, held in place by habit and pride and the accumulated weight of all the times we didn't close it before, which makes closing it now feel somehow like an admission of all those earlier distances. But, sometimes on a gray Tuesday in October, on a gravel forecourt, with the city going about its ordinary business on the other side of iron gates, sometimes something forces it. Some situation pulls the careful management out of your hands. Some secret comes to light not through drama or confrontation but through the simple, unglamorous process of time making its way through everything. And you're left standing in the open air with nothing to hide behind. And the only thing left to do is reach. I spoke to my mother that evening. I don't know why I did. We don't have that kind of relationship, the one where you call after a strange day and say something happened and I can't quite explain it but I need to talk. We've always had the managed kind. The regular Sunday calls. The careful navigation of certain topics. The cheerful surface maintained with something that looks like ease but is actually constant, low-level effort. But I called her. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I didn't have the language for it yet. I just called and we talked about ordinary things, the garden, the weather, something her neighbor had done, and at the end of the call, just before we hung up, she said, "I'm glad you rang, love. I was thinking about you today." And I said, "I know, Mum." And I meant it. Not in the psychic sense. In the sense that I know she thinks about me. In the sense that the management was always coming from love. Even when it felt like exclusion. Even when it left me standing outside a room I didn't have the key to. Love doesn't make the mistakes easier to absorb. But it does make them, eventually, possible to understand. In the days that followed, there were small pieces in the press. Nothing specific. Nothing that would have told you what I've told you here, because the people involved are extraordinarily good at keeping the actual shape of things out of public view. There were photographs from a subsequent engagement, the three of them together, Charles and William and Camilla at something official, some function I can't now remember the details of, and the photographs looked normal. Composed. The standard choreography of royal public life. But, if you looked at the space between William and Camilla, if you looked at the very specific distance they were keeping or not keeping, you might have noticed something. They were standing closer than they usually do. Not by much. A few inches. Less than a foot. Nothing a casual glance would register. But Desmond would have noticed. And I noticed, looking at the photographs on my phone one evening with a cup of tea going warm on the table beside me. They were standing closer. And William's hand, usually clasped behind his back in that careful, trained way, was at his side. Open. I've tried to explain to a few people what I saw that morning. My friend Rachel, who I have lunch with on Wednesdays, listened politely and then said, "But you don't actually know what was happening. You were standing on the pavement." She's right. I was standing on the pavement. I saw three people through iron bars at a distance of 30 or 40 meters on a gray October morning, and I filled in the gaps with inference and feeling and whatever I managed to learn afterwards from unreliable secondhand sources. But here's the thing about being a witness to something. You don't have to be inside the room for the truth of it to reach you. Sometimes the truth of a moment transmits outward through glass and iron and 50 feet of gravel and lodges in the chest of an ordinary woman with a cold coffee and a missed train and a complicated relationship with her own mother. Sometimes the truth of a moment is not in the words or the documents or the official photographs or the carefully worded palace statements. It's in the angle of a hand reaching out. It's in a woman walking through a door she probably should have stayed behind. It's in a sun turning, when touched, and not stepping away. Charles is not well. We all know this in the particular way you know things about public figures that are never quite confirmed and never quite denied, hovering in the middle space between official statement and public perception. His health has been discussed, managed, carefully communicated in language designed to be simultaneously transparent and reassuring. And underneath the managed communication and the official photographs and the continued schedule of engagements, because the engagements continue, they always continue, is a man in his 70s who has spent his entire life preparing for a role and is now inhabiting it at the exact moment when his body has started to make its own demands independent of the schedule. I thought about that on the train home. About what it means to reach for your son when you are a king and you are not well and you understand perhaps for the first time with real bodily clarity that the time available for closing gaps is not infinite. Not because of drama. Not because of crisis. Just because of the simple biological arithmetic of life. Because sooner or later the window closes not through choice but through time. And you would rather close the gap on a Tuesday in October in the gray light, however imperfectly, however exposed it leaves you on a gravel forecourt in front of your own palace. You would rather close it now than wait for the exactly right moment that is never going to come. I went back to London the following week. I didn't plan to go to the palace. I had meetings in the city, and the palace is not exactly on the way. But I found myself walking down the mall on my way back to the station, the same route as the week before, and I stopped at the same spot outside the gates. The bench was dry this time. The sun was actually out, weekend, low but present, doing its October best. There was a different crowd. New tourists. A new school group in different colored high-vis vests. A different mounted cavalry officer. The forecourt was quiet and empty. Gravel undisturbed. Doors closed. I stood there for a few minutes. An older man stopped beside me, no camera, no purpose that I could identify, just a man on a walk, and looked through the gates the way people do. Magnificent, isn't it? He said. Not quite a question. Yes, I said. It is. He stood there a moment longer, then walked on. I stayed a little while. Not because I expected anything to happen. Not because the building owed me a sequel to what I'd witnessed the week before. But because, and this is the only way I know how to say it, there was something still there. Some residue of that gray Tuesday morning. That reaching hand. That red-rimmed woman in the pale coat. That sun, turning. The institution of the British monarchy is old and grand and entirely different from the private lives of the people who inhabit it. And those private lives, complicated, layered, broken in places and repaired in places and still breaking and repairing in real time, have almost nothing to do with the flags and the gates and the gold and the ceremony. They are just lives. Lived in rooms nobody else can see. In spaces between words that don't make it into official statements. In the 20 seconds of silence that opens up on a gravel forecourt when a father takes his son's arm and a wife comes through a door and a secret, finally, comes into the light where it can be looked at together instead of carried alone. I got back to the station. Got on my train. 47 minutes. Surrey gray outside the window. Autumn doing what it does, stripping things back, making the bones of trees visible, honest about the season it is. I thought about secrets. About the weight of carrying them alone. About the specific kind of love that wraps itself in management and protection and ends up, despite all its good intentions, building a room instead of a bridge. And I thought about reaching. About what it costs, and what it might be worth, to close the gap. There are things I'll carry from that morning and things I'll eventually let go of. That's how it always is with the moments that find you unexpectedly. They arrive when your train is late and your coffee is cold and you're not ready for anything significant. They don't ask permission. They just happen. And you stand there, through the iron bars, watching something that was never meant for you. And sometimes it tells you something true. Not about kings and queens and the weight of crowns. But about fathers and sons. About love that gets the method wrong but never the feeling. About secrets that are held for the wrong reasons in the right spirit. About the particular courage it takes, at any age, at any station, to reach out past the careful distance and risk being seen. Charles reached for William. And, in that reaching, without meaning to, without staging it, without any of the deliberate choreography that surrounds every other public moment of their lives, he told the truth. About what he feared losing. About how much it mattered. About the kind of father he was still, stubbornly, refusing to stop trying to be. That is what I will remember most. Not the secret. Not the red-rimmed eyes or the closed doors or the careful distance in the official photographs. The reaching. A hand, extended, across a gravel forecourt, on a gray October Tuesday. And a son who had every reason in the world to step away, who turned instead, and stayed. That, in the end, is the whole story.